Hello everyone, I'm Danayo, a co-founder of the research project System of Systems, joining you from Rotterdam, along with Rebecca Glyn-Blanco and Maria McClintock, who are currently in London. We're pleased to welcome you to this evening's program, Technologising the EU Border, which presents the work of technology and border specialists, media scholars and artists to explore the increasingly technological nature of Europe's borders. Before we unpack the issue at hand and introduce you to our brilliant speakers, we want to take this opportunity to thank Het Nieuwe and the Thursday Night Live team for hosting us tonight. Since 2016, System of Systems has been collaborating with a wide range of practitioners to explore the use of technology and bureaucracy in the asylum-seeking process in Europe. Our research specifically focuses on the system that produces and processes migration under the pretense of security. We have witnessed many shifts in the relationship between technology and borders, both in and beyond Europe's boundaries, where finance and securitization combine to create a nebulous and opaque system that is navigationally impenetrable. To give you a sense of what this means, the reinforcement of the EU's external borders, managed by the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, more commonly known as Frontex, has been closely intertwined with the asylum-seeking system since the establishment of the Schengen Agreement in the mid-1990s. Since then, Frontex has been pledged ever-enlarging budgets by the European Union to monitor and control migration at and beyond Europe's borderlands. Between 2014 and 2020, the European Commission designated 5.6 billion towards the management of external borders, with large sums going towards the agency. For 2021 to 2027, the figure will increase to 21.3 billion, with Frontex receiving 12 billion. And in the wake of the COVID pandemic, the European Commission scaled up research funding even further, setting out a 10 million fund calling for proposals to the research arm, Horizon 2020. Frontex exists as part of a network infrastructure that as a whole encourages the accelerating development of technologies to assist in border management operations. Examples range from the use of biometrics for logging data on migrants through a fingerprint database shared across member states, called Eurodac, or biometrics on the move technology, which aims, quote, to cross the border almost seamlessly thanks to face recognition and touchless scanning of fingerprints, end quote. Other examples include the proposed entry-exit system that collects data of border crossing of third-country nationals at the external border of the EU, abolishing passport stamps, as well as a sprawling continent-wide surveillance system called Eurosur. Technologies and databases, such as the aforementioned, are at the core of current migration policy, which focuses on managing migration flows across and beyond member states. Now, more than ever, with the pandemic raising all sorts of critical questions around the role of borders in contemporary society and the visibility and precarity of those navigating these complex systems, we wanted to contextualize how Europe's borders operate. As Bernd Kasparek highlights in his Migration, Politics and Policies in the European Union, an online publication for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, Frontex has an integrated border management system which offers a new institutional approach to policing the border, with the EU's external border as an entity and instrument fairly at its centre. Thus, operationally, it is a legal grey zone. We are honoured to introduce our 5 speakers, who have each produced a short talk, loosely framed by a set of questions that we posed in relation to our own current research. These include questions such as: how are border technologies used as ways of making and discrediting evidence? How do these technologies produce different ways of crossing the border? How do biometric methods of processing identity reinforce structural racism? As we will see, their contributions add many more questions and approaches to these issues of technology at the border.
First, we'll hear from Matthias Monroy, activist, writer and researcher, who will elucidate some recent developments from Frontex in Europe. Then, Annalisa Pelizza, professor in Science and Technology Studies, will situate her notion of alterity processing in studies around border management. Followed by Ahmet Ögüt, artist and the founder of the Silent University. He will present the Silent University's alternative pedagogical model, which transcends borders and disrupts monolingual education structures. Then Ariana Dongus, media scholar and researcher, will tell us about her research into the evolution of biometrics within humanitarianism and biometric capitalism. And finally, Flavia Dzodan, writer, lecturer and research fellow, will discuss the relationship between body temperature, pandemic borders and ethics. We would like to point out that this is a pre-recorded programme and there will be no live Q&A. However, we would still love to hear from you and keep the conversation going afterwards. There is a chat room where you can leave comments, and you can also contact us at info@systemofsystems.eu. We will be organising more programmes in the coming months, so please keep an eye open. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, albeit virtually. We hope you find the evening interesting. Our first speaker is knowledge worker and activist, Matthias Monroy. Matthias is editor of the journal SILIP, which has existed since 1978, providing reports, analysis and news on police, secret services, internal security politics and civil rights. His own journalism focuses on policing in the European Union, migration control, undercover cops, internet monitoring, surveillance and interception technologies. Matthias will be elaborating on the current use of drones by Frontex and expanding on two specific technologies currently under development called RoBorder and Foldout. It's important to note, as Matthias mentions, that these technologies are being funded by the biggest EU research and innovation programme called Horizon 2020. Horizon 2020 is the financial instrument implementing the Innovation Union, with a focus on promoting excellent science, industrial leadership and tackling societal challenges to ensure Europe's global competitiveness, as they write on their website. The funding body in part acts as the research and development department of border technologies, funding university research units and companies alike to develop emerging technologies to survey, restrict or predict border crossings with names such as iBorder Control, Trespass or Sunny.
Hey, I will now try to explain a little bit the situation of the usage of drones at the Fortress Europe and some different aspects. So I would like to start with Frontex, the EU border agency, which is using drones since a while. So there were many kind of tests that were done in the Mediterranean. So, for example, Frontex was flying drones from Crete and from in Greece and from Sicily. So the idea was to operate with so-called MALE drones, medium altitude, long endurance, which means so they can stay in the air for a couple of hours. And the drones that were operating from Sicily were from the Italian company Leonardo. And they were kind of small MALE drones. So, and they will operate in the central Mediterranean, and the same applies to the drones that Frontex was operating in Crete. They came from Israel, from the company IAI. And as Leonardo, IAI is also an arms company. So that's a quite interesting fact in my opinion, that all these drone projects, they all use drones that were developed for the military. And in terms of the Israeli one, they were also tested in war theaters, they are combat proven, even if they, of course, for Frontex are unarmed in the Mediterranean. So Frontex tested these drones for their own purpose. And the idea is that Frontex in future will have their own drones patrolling in the central Mediterranean, but also eastern and western Mediterranean. Frontex made a tender last year that ended in January, and they are now seeking a supplier for large mail drones. And the idea is to station them somewhere in the middle of the Mediterranean. It's not clear if this is Italy, Malta, or it could be even Greece. And in the tender, they said they want to have drones that can fly at least 20 hours and should carry at least 230 kilogram. That means, of course, that they will carry like payload of like surveillance cameras, infrared cameras, whatever. And it's not clear when they will start to operate. The tender was saying that they should like the contract should be for 2 years, and it could be prolonged up to another 2 years. So this is something that we will see in future probably, like the surveillance with these long range, long endurance drones. And until the Frontex drones are operating, Frontex is now making use of drones from another agency, which is the European Maritime Safety Agency, EMSA. And it's perhaps interesting to mention that there's a third agency, which is EFCA, which is the European Fishery Agency, Fishery Control. And all three agencies are operating in the Mediterranean in terms of maritime security, each one for a different aspect. Like, for example, the EMSA is like controlling maritime pollution, for example. And all of them want to make better use of drones. So 3 years ago, they made a cooperation agreement, all three agencies. And they want to better benefit from the capacities of each other. So this is not only applying for drones, it's also for satellite surveillance. But talking about drones, the EMSA now started an own drone service, which covers like mail drones, as mentioned before, but also smaller ones, helicopter drones, which have a payload of something like 30 kilograms, the Austrian ones, up to small quadrocopters, like the police are sometimes using. And the EMSA is offering these services to many member states, not only EU, also Schengen. So Iceland was the first one that is now ordering the drone service of large Israeli military mail drone from the company Elbit. It's a Hermes 900. And also Germany is now making a test. Also the UK was testing them in the English Channel, for example. And this is just like to give you an overview, like a small picture of the development of drones in terms of surveillance of the Fortress Europe. Okay, let me continue with some other projects that give a little bit an idea of what these drones are used for. Next one is a ROB order. It's a EU security research program financed by the Commission, and it's kind of a system of systems. It's using 4 different unmanned vehicles. So one drone, as we already talked about, like aerial surveillance, and then it's a ground surveillance. It's a little tank that is operating on the ground, and then you have like 2 water drones, one surface vehicle and one underwater unmanned vehicle. And the idea is that they operate all together in the same scenario. The scenario is always migration, like there is somebody intruding in the sea or land border and should be detected by the vessel. And you have like different companies participating, like always. And the trials will be held in Hungary, in Portugal, and in Greece. So in Hungary, it's a bit interesting as well. It's in the at the border crossing point in Röszke. I don't know if I pronounced that right. Perhaps you know this from a couple of years ago. There had been like big riots at the Hungarian border. That was in, if I'm not mistaken, in 2016. So not at the very beginning of the so-called summer of migration, and where also people were arrested and went to court for terrorism. And this is where the unmanned ground vehicle should be tested. It's a small one, so but it's interesting to mention that Frontex already, that must have been in 2012, they were also having an own project to develop like unmanned ground vehicles, kind of tanks. And they did it together with the Israeli company IAI that I was already mentioning. It's the company that is producing the Heron drones. And so back to Rob Order. So the unmanned ground vehicle that is used in Rob Order is much smaller than the Talos tanks that were developed for Frontex. By the way, the Talos, they were never used. They must stand around in some shelter and might be a bit rusty now. And so you have the unmanned ground vehicle tested in Röschke, and then you have the surface, the water, like surface and underwater tested in Portugal, and you have the flying drone tested in Greece. And what is interesting for me as well is that in this project you can see like the idea is what do they do with all the information that the drones are collecting. And the idea is that some of the drones can patrol on at the borders and just check what's going on and give an alarm if like an intruder, like a migrant is detected. And then other drones can start to operate. For example, the flying drone can operate like regularly all day and patrol the borders. And if there is, for example, a boat detected, a suspicious boat, then the surface drone, the unmanned surface vehicle, could start to operate, could be sent to like inspect the vessel. And this gives a little bit an idea of this belief in technology that is behind this harnessing Fortress Europe with unmanned vehicles. So all the information in this Rob Order project is being collected in a vehicle, in a kind of van. It's a German one, and it's built by the company Elettronica, which sounds Italian, but it's a German company. And they are specialized in signal intelligence normally. So they work together with secret services, but they also do all other kinds of like broadcasting communication. And the same van that they offer for like the Rob Order project, where all the information is collected, the same van could be equipped also for intelligence purpose, for example, like to intercept communication. It is MUROS. It's multi-role operations support vehicle. And this MUROS, as I said, it's could be used by police, by border police, by secret services, and this is like with different equipment. And they have like kind of monitors, antennas. It's a situation center, a mobile situation center that can drive around at the borders and start and monitor, control all the missions. To end this explanation about the Rob Order project, it's meant to complete also the Eurosur system. Eurosur is the surveillance system that Frontex is operating from Warsaw. It contains, like, it collects all the information that is received at the borders, if it's like radar, infrared, whatever, from the different member states. And the idea is that Rob Order also feeds the Eurosur system, and it will end next year. and in February in 2021. And as always in these kind of projects, there will be like a final report given. Yeah. Okay, and finally, I will explain the project Foldout. Foldout is an abbreviation for through foliage detection, including the outermost regions of the EU. Like rope order, it's also a system of systems, so it's not only consisting of drones, it's also satellite surveillance and so-called stratobus, and including sensors on the ground. It's again the detection of unwanted migration, like irregular border crossings. And the idea is like you have a cascade of different means to detect people that are crossing a border with sensors on the ground that are like acoustic or thermosensors or cameras, which are like all being put in a small kind of box that can be placed everywhere. Like Foldout is meant for regions with big forests, so that's perhaps the explanation why border forces from eastern countries like Poland, Bulgaria, and Lithuania are involved. Then you have like on a more higher level, like for example, helicopters or drones flying and patrolling. And on the more higher level, you have like a stratobus that is operating the stratosphere, which is also an unmanned vehicle. And this is the reason why Thales, the arms company from France, is involved, because they have such a project that they are kind of advertising also to the European Union. That is, it can carry like a heavy payload, and it's it's kind of always there. It's a mixture between drones and satellites. And with the satellites, you can, so this is where the name comes from, Foldout. You can use radar satellites that are capable to see also through the leaves of the trees in the forests. I mean, radar technology, these LiDAR radars can also be transported by drones, of course, and by the helicopters. And this is a bit the idea, to use it like in crowded areas. Like rope order, Foldout is also being is also under the responsibility of the European Commission. It's being financed under the Horizon 2020 program. In that case, it's 8 million euro. This is more or less the amount like of many of the Horizon 2020 programs. Like it's between 8 to 15 million, all these security research programs, and normally half of the money comes from the EU and half of the money comes from the companies involved. And it's being tested in various areas, and from next year on there will be like trials in different countries. So this was a little bit to give you an idea about the usage of drones in the European Union. I would call it like to harness the Fortress Europe. Like you have the drones in the Mediterranean, you have the drones in the English Channel, you have like, so this is ongoing. This is where they are already deployed. And now they are more and more being tested in at the green borders. So this is what rope order and Foldout is meant for. And this will take some years until they will be deployed. But just to give you an overview. Well, thanks.
Thank you, Matthias, for such a thorough and wide-ranging presentation. You can find Matthias's extensive and always up-to-date articles on these issues on his site, digit.site36.net, as well as on netzpolitik.org and many other left-wing German newspapers. Now we go to Annalisa Pelizza, who will zoom into one specific form of low-tech data collection at so-called hotspots in Greece and Italy. Annalisa is based between the University of Bologna and the University of Twente, where she is Professor of Science and Technology Studies. Her research focuses on governance by data infrastructures shaping modern institutions. She has been the recipient of several European Commission scientific grants and currently leads the Processing Citizenship Research Group, investigating transnational data infrastructures for migration management as activities of European governance transformation. Annalisa will be discussing the notion of alterity processing, which she introduced in a paper in March this year. In this paper, she writes, "At once more holistic and more specific than migration management, alterity processing refers to the data infrastructures, practices, and bureaucratic procedures through which populations unknown to European actors are translated into European legible identities. In this tension, it is not only the individual other who is enacted, but also specific bureaucratic orders cutting across old and new European actors and distinctive understandings of Europe." Over to you, Annalisa.
Good evening. I'm Annalisa Pelizza. I'm a professor of science technology studies at University of Bologna, University of Twente, and I coordinate the Process and Citizenship Research Project that involves 5 other researchers. And in this project, we study the digital border of Europe. So I've been following the work of the System of Systems since a couple of years, and I would like to thank Rebecca, Glyn-Blanco, Danaio, and Marielle McClintock for continuing our conversation. Today, I wish to ask you a question. When does someone become a migrant? When they decide to leave their homes? When they embark on a boat? When they cross the border? Well, probably there's no single moment, and everybody has a different answer to that. Yet tonight I wish to suggest that one of the moments when people on the move become migrant is when they enter information systems that are used for migration management, when they enter these data infrastructures that are used to manage populations. Think about it. Up to that moment, people are still siblings, mothers, teachers, engineers, citizens. They are not known yet by the authorities of the countries that they are trying to enter. At least most of them are not. But once they enter the classification systems, the data infrastructures, and their data are registered, then they become migrants, refugees, border crossers, irregular. This is what I mean with the concept of alterity processing, which I have recently introduced in a journal article for Science, Technology, and Human Values, open access, that tells also other stories about the transformation of people into migrants by means of technological mediation. So what I mean with processing of alterity refers to the data, the infrastructures, and the procedures, the practices through which people who are unknown become legible to European authorities. So their identities are translated into some kind of European legible identity. So these technologies can appeal as a veil of progress, efficiency, or even justice. And this is especially due to their use of high techs. Last generation fingerprints, retina scanners, drones, interoperable systems, they all contribute to the image of the high-tech border. Well, I have conducted ethnographic research in Italy and Greece and can tell that the processing of alterity is actually an assemblage of high and low technologies, of efficient and rather cumbersome procedures. So in order to discuss how people unknown to authorities are translated into European readable identities without being dazzled by the radiance of high technologies, today I want to focus on an extremely low-tech method for classifying people at the border, the bracelets. This is a paper bracelet used by NGOs working with people rescued at sea. It's an absolute mundane technology that shows that technology can create migrants in different ways, or more precisely, that border crossers can be enacted in different ways depending on the use of technology. So my story focuses on a case I observed during disembarkation at a registration center, a hotspot in Sicily. It is a story of a mundane technology like bracelets that can enact migrants either as individuals endowed with human rights or as populations that can bring with them threats to public health and to some extent also need protection. So in summer 2017, I followed the procedures of disembarkation of people rescued at sea by an NGO ship. So as soon as they were rescued and embarked on the ship, the rescued went through health triage by an NGO medical crew, and that was already on the ship. So upon diagnosis, they were given bracelets in different colors, indicating different health conditions. So red bracelets, like the one you're seeing in this picture, were given to all the adults, while yellow bracelets were given to unaccompanied minors. Blue bracelets were given to all people recognized as vulnerable, either because they were tortured, or raped, or they had other types of illnesses, or they were pregnant. And a blue bracelet with a black stripe was given to people affected by scabies. So this bracelet coding system adopted by the NGO was a sophisticated method to translate a chain of violence and vulnerability into a color, into something that was visible without being intrude the body of the person. And at the same time, this bracelet coding system preserved privacy and excluded unauthorized observers. Let me explain why. NGO physicians on board detected bodily signs of violence or vulnerability and translated them into an extrasomatic artifact, the bracelet. So this meant that a person didn't need to undergo a second medical inspection at the border, once at the port, because the medical conditions were already made visible through the bracelet color. In other words, we can say that it was the bracelet which spoke for the body. And the health situation could be ascertained without the need for a second medical inspection once arrived at the port. So this simple technology translated health conditions into bracelet color, and in so doing made the state physician at the port redundant. Since a second medical inspection was not needed anymore, even the state physician at the port was not needed anymore. But that was not the whole story. The bracelet system also selected who could access data about the individual's health condition. So only the crew on board knew how to associate a color to an illness. So other people on board, guests or rescued, didn't have access to the rubric, so didn't know what color corresponded to and couldn't associate a health condition to that. So the rubric associated illnesses and colors acted as a metadata that associated bracelet colors with health conditions. And only those who had access to the rubric, so the ship crew, could actually interpret the data. So in other words, the bracelet technology was thought to safeguard individual privacy. So The NGO standard procedure of disembarkation was meant to preserve such attention to privacy. The procedure indeed provided that NGO physicians reached the dog as first, before the rescued, in order to hand over the rubric to the hotspot authorities, to the state authorities. So only once authorities had access to the rubric, the rescued were disembarked. Or at least that was the standard procedure used by the NGO. Well, during my observation, this procedure prompted by the NGO, well, it counter-resistant by hotspot authorities who imposed a different procedure. So authorities asked that the rescue were disembarked before the crew. Authorities didn't receive the rubric to interpret the colors, and indeed didn't use the bracelets as a form of classification. So hotspot authorities held a second medical inspection to ascertain violence and vulnerability from scratch once people were at the border. So in this way, the role of the physicians, of the state physician, was reestablished. But that was not all. The hotspot authorities replaced bracelet colors with spatial allocation. So while for NGOs, it was the color of the bracelet that represented the health condition, once at the port, it was the spatial allocation of people on the dock, which worked as data. Indeed, the rescued were allocated to different areas of the dock according to their type of illness or vulnerability. So people were scabies were put in a group, unaccompanied minors were gathered in another group at another side of the dock, and so on. So with this sorting technique, spatial allocation worked as data. And the association between spatial allocation and illness was the metadata. Yet, differently from the rubric, keeping this metadata confidential was not only always possible. The association between area of the dog and illness was often orally expressed. And so everybody who was on the dog or a hearing distance could understand, interpret which health conditions people were in. So I suggest to look at this divergence in NGO and hotspot procedures as metadata frictions. And these metadata frictions enact people on the move in different ways, and they also enact different distribution of tasks and different values. The bracelet coding system enacted the rescued as individuals endowed with human rights, and privacy was the most important human right above all. And this procedure also bypassed the role of state physicians. While by spatially sorting people out, hotspot authorities enacted the rescued not as individuals, but as populations. And as such, as population, they can be the bearers of illnesses and also be affected by some illnesses. And therefore, this data and metadata procedure was designed according to the principle of avoiding contagion among the rescued and also between the rescued and the broader population. So in summary, this case shows two things. First, that different ways of creating data and metadata can enact people in different ways, either as individuals who need endowed with privacy and human rights, or as populations that have to be isolated and protected. And it's remarkable that this difference is revealed even with basic, mundane, very low technologies, as bracelet colors. You can imagine how many possibilities are triggered by more sophisticated interoperable systems. And second, this case shows tensions between procedures implemented by NGOs and procedures imposed by state authorities. And I think it allows uncovering the governance implications of alternative processing. Different organizations struggle to legitimize some actors, like the NGO physicians or the state physicians, some distribution of tasks, and some values. And in this struggle, it's not just alterity which is enacted, but also specific organizational assemblages, specific polities, and specific understandings of Europe. So, to answer the question from by the organizer about how different technologies create people, well, indeed, technologies create different ways of crossing the border because they enact border crossers in different ways. The case that I have discussed shows that methods of processing alterity are not good or bad in themselves, but rather that they can be used to reinforce institutional racism or to further human rights like privacy. Difference is made by their situated use and implementation. So let me please finish with a quote by Donna Haraway, according to which there are only highly specific visual possibilities, each with a wonderfully detailed, active, partial way of organizing words. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Annalisa. I think what's really interesting about this paper and research more generally is how it pushes us to reconsider what we take to be data and even what we see as technology. We really recommend reading her article in the SAGE journal mentioned earlier and also visiting the Processing Citizenship site for more information. Next, we're delighted to welcome Ahmet Ögüt. Ahmet is an artist based between Amsterdam and Berlin. In 2012, he completed a year-long residency at Tate and the Delphina Foundation, resulting in the ongoing project The Silent University. He also co-represented Turkey at the 53rd Venice Biennale together with Banu Cenetoglu and is currently an advisor at the Jan van Eyck Academy. Moving us away from technology briefly, but sticking with the implication of borders, Ahmet will discuss his project The Silent University, a solidarity-based knowledge exchange platform by displaced people and forced migrants. In their own words, it's an education platform outside of the restrictions of migration laws, language limitations, and the other bureaucratic obstacles. Ahmet will elaborate on the importance of maintaining this long-term project, alongside an ongoing institutional critique.
Hi, this is Ahmet Ögüt. I'm starting with a slide of a drawing, part of a recent series I did, which was dealing with the borders and the playfulness of borders, which is normally not so playful to talk about or deal with. So in this example, you see a little 9-year-old British tourist enter Turkey through the airport, confusing with her toy passport that is actually a unicorn, and this passport was stamped by the officer at the passport control, and that was in the news later. Knowing how hard it could be crossing borders nowadays, such examples also do exist. One more time reminds us this idea about a nation state and documentation, recognition, and authorization is quite fictive. From there, I would like to go back to 1951, when that was the first International Refugee Convention was signed by almost all the countries, most of the countries, and that was the definition of the term refugee. Is any person who, owning a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reason of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his/her nationality and is unable to, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself/herself of the protection of that country. That was the definition. And also the definition of de facto refugee, person not recognized as a refugee and who is unable to, or for reasons recognized as valid, unwilling to return to their country of origin or country of nationality, or if they have no nationality, to the country of their habitual residence. Today, there has been other terms, vulnerable communities, forced migrants, humanitarian protection applicants, that are being used by the academics, by the researchers, by the activists, and by the artists, replacing the word refugee. Refugee word was necessary in 1951 as a definition, but today it's also misused a lot, so we need to think about it in a critical way. Meanwhile, to recognize people who have no documents and no legal permission to pass borders, the importance of that is as urgent, even more urgent these days. Uh, it's also important not to see those people as incapable of or unknowledgeable group of people. Going from this to explain this, I want to explain you Silent University briefly. Initiation of Silent University. In 2012, officially we announced the Silent University, which started with an invitation I got to a residency program in London. But I realized working with a community, that was the aim of the residency program. I was asked to do so. It cannot be a format that comes with a short promise. And what I saw in London at the time in 2012, this is way beyond Brexit times. It was very urgent. The community organizations were very well organized. What I saw, based on categories like neighborhoods or old people's houses, or only women house, or teenagers from certain countries, and there was this categories each community center organization was focusing on. But what I realized that that's not the approach I want to categorize people, but to have an individual approach based on something that is knowledge. And the importance of knowledge, no matter from what language it comes, from which part of the world it comes, and the immediate importance of acknowledgement and recognition of knowledge seemed very urgent, but there was no organization focusing on or addressing that issue. Here you can see a very important theorician, Saskia Sassen, as she mentioned. We should focus on recognition instead of authorization. And that's what Silent University did from the very first day. We invited everyone to take part as members, as lecturers, as consultants in their original languages, in their original pedagogy background. Here another comment from Chantal Mouffe, when she sees Silent University rather than an art project. It was very important in the beginning to clarify this is not a project about, it's not a project itself, it's not a workshop also. These were the terminologies that were used that was basically addressing how short-term engagement are those kind of practices because of the nature of funding and the way the art institutions involved with such initiatives. But Silent University has been aiming that's kind of long-term commitment and has been aiming really not to abandon anyone who believed in the idea and trusted the idea, but the opposite, not limit itself with the framework of an art project and so on, but really use the facilities of art institutions can provide together with the universities and NGOs and other community organizations in collaboration. So this collaboration was kind of important principle from the very first day. This is another quote from the text Paul Preciado. wrote after witnessing a silent university meeting in Athens, where there was at least 5 or more languages involved in one meeting, which showed that monolingual education system that wasn't the center and cannot be the center of the education system as we know today. It is not only for silent universities to take this as a kind of challenge, but it's very important to imagine all around the world the urgency to address that. Therefore, we can recognize the knowledge of anyone coming from anywhere right away. Otherwise, the process of integration, as it's suggested by most nation states, is a frustrating process, and it doesn't recognize the existing knowledge that people come with. Here you can see some of the Silent University. First edition of the Silent University was in London, and some of the participants you can see here from Stockholm and London branches with names, and sometimes it was not even possible to share the faces or names in full, so only initials. The approach was very important and very sensitive, that it's not about grouping people, but it is about this paying attention to hypersensitivity of their situation in terms of not putting their relatives in danger in the countries they come from, or not putting themselves in danger where they are still in the process, in this delicate, fragile process of getting their documents. So at first, almost all the participants were asylum seekers, either undocumented, not even having in the process, or waiting for years. Although they have done their applications, they have no answers yet. They had no answers by that time yet. Here you can see the diversity among the lecturers and consultants of Silent University, from journalists to teachers to human rights activists to accountant to calligrapher and lawyer and a nurse and a doctor and so on, which shows the diversity, how far it can extend itself. So this immediate acknowledgement also made it possible for anyone to involve with their own previous titles or achievements or based on their previous education back in their countries. And we tried to find ways to not to delay the process more, even if that would potentially put someone in danger. If we directly share their faces or their names, we immediately found ways and try to figure out ways how they can go in front of public, but still share their knowledge. After a few years involving with Silent University, some of the participants get their process faster, and they were able to get residence permits, or even towards after a few years, some of them got citizenships. So position has been evolving, and it was important part was involving with this education platform. Here you can see that it's also possible to represent the lectures in any language that is preferred. It will be mother tongue, or it will be preferred language of the presenter. This is some of the current branches, and it was expanding itself, Silent University, to several cities. After London, it moved to Stockholm. There was another branch, and then they continued till today. It's almost 9 years now. And in also rural area, and in Germany, there was 2 initiatives, and one of them, Hamburg, was 5 years very active and reactivated. And Mülheim branch is very stable and active since many years, and continue to remain active. And there are also new initiatives like Copenhagen branch is the most recent initiative, and not a top-down or institution-initiated version, but more initiated by the activists, local activists, in collaboration with the participants, lecturers. Here is one of the gatherings we had silent university coordinator coming from Amman, Athens at the time. It's a publication we produced. So the idea was like the first members who involved slowly take over the initiative itself. So they start maybe like lecturers focusing on their own lecture, and then they can become coordinators, and then coordinators can become co-organizers and initiators and leaders, basically co-leaders. So in the case of Fahima that was the case. She still ran her language cafe and student-to-student advice meetings, least twice a week meetings through the Tensta Konsal over many years, leading the Silent University Stockholm branch. That was very important, that this taking initiative from within and keeping the autonomy as a parasitic organization within the collaborating institutions gave Silent University a long life. There are a couple of meetings and some of images from meetings in Hamburg. Going back to the question of borders, seeing Silent University centered around another language in every country, in every case, like in Germany, it had to be the German language in the center of it, or normally, or in Sweden, Swedish, and but all we did was the same thing, and the way it was coordinated was the same thing. But to apply this to different nation states, this global issue, required different kind of methodology in every country, and that was only possible to figure out with the local participants. And then important to stay in touch with the other branches and share their experiences as well. So all of a sudden it wasn't important what is the central language, either it's Swedish, German, or English, or any other language. But what was important, that this multilingual approach that emancipates certain way of existence of the initiative beyond the borders of nation state, beyond the issues that every individual had to deal with. I mean, it was already back then one of the most difficult place to be as an asylum seeker was UK, and this was pre-Brexit times. After Brexit, UK citizens themselves became in the same situation, first time probably to experience the same thing. Or during now the pandemic times, European citizens also had some sort of border crossing issues, maybe for the first time in their lives. This is only a small proxy getting close to what actually asylum seekers always had to deal with of all these years. It's another initiative gathering in Hamburg, another gathering in Hamburg, a protest gathering in Hamburg. Silent University took part. These are Mülheim. Format also changing. Sometimes it's turn more towards the direction of an action. Sometimes it's more classical academic platform, with lectures performed in multiple languages with PowerPoints. It's the group of coordinators. They took over initiative after first director and first curator, who was the coordinator themselves, and continue to run Silent University in Mülheim. One of the coordinators, Brigitte, organized a women empowerment network within the Silent University, because there was also cases some of the women couldn't attend the mixed meetings. This is when we were rewriting the Silent University principles, which was very important from the beginning to have practical principles and also ideological principles. And to rethink the principles in another language, in Arabic, was quite important to see how do we experience, how do we represent our ideas and still functional in multiple languages. So it always depends which city we are. You can see the principles appeared in many different languages, here in Greek language, English, and that's the last slide. So one of the last principle on the list is decentralized, participatory, horizontal, and autonomous modality of education. So Silent University has been imagining an education that is beyond nation state from the very first day. That's beyond the borders that as we know today and as we know the way it changed today. It was already beyond that kind of approach. This is not a formula that is Silent University activated by Silent University by asylum seekers only for asylum seekers. That is the solution for entire education system globally. If you're going to use this term global, which we were falsely used until now, it was falsely used until now, if such thing exists in terms of knowledge exchange, we really have to think of the role of language and cultures and this local knowledge that is being exchanged beyond nation state idea. Beyond the existing border politics, when the borders tend to act differently, close itself, become more claustrophobic, also for the others who enjoy the privilege, still the education system can still continue to function. And that's very important thing to keep ourselves, remind ourselves, and then that will make us be more prepared for in times of crisis like the ones we are facing right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Ahmet for such an interesting presentation. I thought it was brilliant that you set out the kind of material, social and political conditions in which the Silent University emerged from, as well as the ways in which this new institution exists outside very, very knotty and granular kind of judicial obstacles and bureaucratic obstacles that so many migrants are facing. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about the project, I came across this really brilliant publication which takes the namesake, the Silent University Towards a Transversal Pedagogy, which was published between MIT Press and Sternberg Press in 2016. And I'd really recommend having a look at that if you're interested. Next, I'm really delighted to welcome Ariana Dongus, who's a media scholar and researcher based between Berlin and Karlsruhe. She explores the intersection of biometrics, colonial past, new forms of work, and machine intelligence, and through which is contributing to a critique of today's digital economies, and her recent publications include both essays and journalistic reports. Ariana is a PhD candidate at University of Arts and Design at Karlsruhe, where she also coordinates Artificial Intelligence and Media Philosophy KIM, which is a research group for critical studies in both of those subject areas, and again, I'd recommend having a look at that group if you're interested in either artificial intelligence and or media philosophy. This evening, Ariana has prepared a presentation exploring three of the key themes that have emerged throughout her work, one of which being humanitarian experimentation, and in this case, she's specifically alluding to the use of iris guard scanners, which are used in UNHCR camps across Jordan. Secondly, her work around biometric capitalism, and finally, the European border as a site of growing investment and profit. And she talks about this within this kind of theoretical framework and borrowed term called the border as method, which she'll get into a little bit later on. Over to Ariana.
Yeah, good evening, everyone behind the screens. I hope you're well. I want to thank Rebecca, Danae, and Maria for inviting me to contribute to Systems of Systems today. And I want to share bits of my research that I conduct within the framework of my teaching and my PhD project at University of Arts and Design in Karlsruhe. And I work there with Matteo Pasquinelli in our research group KIM, which stands for Artificial Intelligence and Media Philosophy, when you spell it out in German. And it's a research group for critical studies in artificial intelligence. And in our projects, we politicize AI by addressing emerging new complex realities that it brings with it. And we also criticize the techno-euphoria around AI, but also assess its potentialities, for instance, in digital activism. Today I speak about the application of high tech, that is big data, machine learning, and foremost biometrics in the humanitarian context, specifically in the case or in the context of refugee camps. And I present my research on iris scanning in UNHCR administered camps in Jordan. My argument is to say that migration movements caused by conflicts and wars have become a key site of economic extraction, accumulation, as well as market expansion for tech companies. And with regard to biometrics, they are an important interface to organize economic activity that I refer to as biometric capitalism later. And although the technologies deployed are very sophisticated, the modes how they come into being through experimental testing open up a hidden history of experimentation, to use the phrase of sociologist Katja Linskov-Jacobsen, with specific colonial continuities attached. In the last step of this presentation, I'd like to propose to understand how the movement of migration itself is a social movement. It's actively shaping EU policies. But before we get into this, I'd like to briefly situate the humanitarian context itself. So what the introduction of new high-tech devices like iris scanning have in common with earlier tools of humanitarian government is a very basic question, and that is how to manage the undesirables. This is a term famously coined by sociologist Michel Agier that reflects on how refugees and migrants can and should be managed. Now, in this term, although with the word undesirable, of course, already pointing to the fact that the European Union does not have any interest to welcome them a lot, the rather neutral term management might need further contextualization, also in order to introduce my reading of the term humanitarianism. So I pick up from the tradition of critical humanitarian studies. Michel Agier comes from there as well, to understand management in refugee camps or in hotspots like Moria that we witness these days as a sovereign will of liberal states to regulate, contain and confine movement in order to effectively deal with what EU policies frame as disaster. In that sense, refugee camps are the border in front or behind the European border, depending who you are and where you stand. And through that, essentially, constitute barriers of access to the EU asylum system. This is all within the ongoing overall process of ever-hardening external borders. The borders behind the borders are of systematic importance to govern global migration movements, because more than 80% of people who migrate, who flee, remain in the countries of the global south, an essential fact that is often neglected in mainstream media coverage in Europe. The critical in humanitarian studies refers to the fact that usually humanitarianism is connected to the idea of doing good, of caring for distant strangers by providing relief in times of particular suffering. Intrinsically linked to modern Western humanitarianism, however, is the conflict between care and control. There is no care without control. As Michel Agier puts it, how should we interpret the disturbing symbiosis between the hand that cares and the hand that strikes, the hand that confines movement and surveys but gives bread and shelter? To propose a possible answer, I want to follow here Polly Pallister-Wilkins, a great researcher from Amsterdam University, who includes arguments that also deal with the idea of colonial humanitarianism. And she picks up how care, quote, care for distant strangers, deployed expansive moral geographies that were concomitantly about saving colonized others and, importantly, maintaining a liberal order at home. This means to say that humanitarianism, in its ambivalent role for caring, or in its ambivalent role of caring for and controlling the distant stranger, is directly connected to the liberal order of European nation states and the management of European citizenry. At the same time, the twisted moral trope of care for those who necessarily must remain othered in the distance serves as an essential justifying tool in narratives of legitimization of certain policies. To put simply, care is not innocently and inherently a positive practice in itself. It is not neutral, not detached from the material realities. This argument has many further layers, but what I would like to pick up for today is the point of connection that is introduced here. We cannot think of the distant stranger without also thinking about the art of government over lives and citizens in Europe. There's a link, and it's not an idealistic or pure moral one, but a rather crucial one for the social organization of Western societies. So I'd like to start the second part now on biometric registration through iris scans with this statement that might be provocative to some. It's an open question here. The future of the West is tested in the camps and borderlands, and I'm not talking about this today, but we could add in the favelas and ghettos of today. In the current landscapes of extreme inequalities for the majority of people on one hand and the concentration of capital in the hands of few, poor countries and regions of conflict are becoming a test site of extraction and accumulation of data for high-tech companies. The reading I propose turns the usual idea of where and by whom technology is produced, usually in the rich and savvy countries of the West, upside down, undermining the powerful narrative that the developed West is the site where technological innovations originate and then spread around the globe. A crucial parenthesis must be added here right away. These new devices, full of flaws and errors, by no means work perfectly from the onset. Also, despite the vision of the authorities that are pushing for iris scanning, resistance to control and greater surveillance by the state or other agencies in general is happening and always has been happening. In fact, I argue that the resistance to the policies is actively shaping the way migration and refugee strategies and discourses are laid out. I will address more of this later. We look at the Satari and Asraq refugee camps in Jordan. There, UNHCR cooperates with the company IrisGuard, which delivers the technology to perform iris recognition in refugee camps. So I will show you now a little video that I did. It just plays without sound. Then you can get some impressions of the CEO and of the company. So this is Imad Malhas. To make a short and important excursus, in the company history of IrisGuard, the dual use of care and control becomes eminent once again. IrisGuard started out with equipping US-American prisons and Saudi Arabian border police, then, after the start of the Syrian war, turned towards the humanitarian sector. In the interview I did with the CEO, he explained how iHood, the name of the device, can be adjusted to various needs. To a dual use, it can be mobile for police officers, mounted in a refugee registration site or a camp supermarket. In the future, it should even become the prototype for all-round products dealing with identification. The close ties with security industries and intelligence apparatuses becomes visible in the composition of the board of directors. We find Richard Dearlove, who was until 2004 director of the British Foreign Intelligence Service MI6. There was also Francis Townsend, who was from 2004 to 2008 consultant for Homeland Security of then President George W. Bush. Here's another piece of promotion material that we got from them. You can see, know them before it's too late, and you see the passport control. Another screenshot of the eye, the process of capturing the eyes. Okay, but let us go back to the refugee camps now. Since 2013, all people arriving in the Jordanian Zatari or Asraq camp must register their irises. IrisGuard is one of several companies UNHCR cooperates with, so it's a complex system of partners. IrisGuard alone has installed around 300 registration sites worldwide and scanned more than 2.5 million refugees. Produced in an automated way, the eye barcode is then uploaded to a cloud server. The UNHCR's database can potentially track, tag, monitor, and predict their consumer behavior as well as their movement. The mode of data mining is compulsory since receiving food and relief aid is in large parts distributed through a biometric management system. So what has started as an experimental test field among Afghan refugees in Peshawar in the early 2000s has evolved into a massive project of biometric data management and storage, and in fact has become a central strategic decision for UNHCR today. Put in a critical perspective, you could say their strategy is to say no scan, no data, no registration, no support, no food. It is very problematic that no alternative to scanning is offered. UNHCR has, but only since 2015, an admittedly vague data protection policy. The policy sounds good in the first place because it states that agreements to process biometric data must be given informed and freely. But the compulsory connection of giving your biometric data in order to obtain refugee status contradicts this, I think, as you cannot opt out. Is this a free and informed decision? These databases can have potentially and already had life-threatening consequences if they fall into the wrong hands, if you consider the case of the Rohingya, for instance. So the risks of biometric governments or biometric governance are then and now outsourced to the people. The weak link is the user, never the machine. It becomes visible now that in reality it is the people who feed these biometric machines, who make them work, make them safe, and then appear smart. It is the people, it is not the machines. And it's the people who have to endure machinic failures, errors like false positives or a general malfunctioning, human-made errors like data misuse or even leaks. On purpose or not on purpose. In a loop that circles back, it is exactly these people who are disciplined by the very machines they have been forced to build in the first place. So, scanned irises now replace cash, and people pay with their eyes in camp supermarkets. And here we see biometric capitalism at work. I take the term from historian Keith Breckenridge, and according to him, it is a system of, quote, economic activity organized around the centralized unitary database, or a biometrical ordered registered population. And this means that economic transactions and exchange, as well as interaction with authorities, when it comes about proving your identity, is effectively organized via a digital interface, which is drastically different to a paper-based system. Importantly, biometrics, among other digital tools, also mark the invention of the manageable refugee. As more and more parts of her life, her daily practices, her habits become legible, digitally legible, her life also can be acted upon. Decisions can be made about her, interventions conducted, on demand, against different humanitarian moralistic frameworks. And this, of course, does never render the older forms of power obsolete, but rather they're adding up. So it's a form of new digital intervention that is going into the more fine-grained aspects of her life. For instance, patronizing claims by the quasi-state agency, UNHCR, or the World Food Programme can be made about how to live and to eat. People should buy rice, yes, but they should not buy cigarettes or alcohol. The official neoliberal narrative that goes like being a more efficient and cost-saving UN agency, because they are always underfunded already, is by avoiding the fraudulent refugee doppelganger. Since the structure of the human iris is unique, and maybe, I don't know, it starts again. Since the structure of the human iris is unique, no refugee could technically register twice and receive support twice. And this is intimately connected with constructing the image of, I think, dishonest and suspicious refugees who thus naturally, a priori, need to be controlled and governed and contained. So we could see here the creation of an indebted neoliberal subject that receives a service rather than exercises her refugee rights. It's a form, I think, of moral and racist generalization also, because it effectively dehumanizes the plurality and complexities of the people at stake. Although I do not intend to blame the humanitarian sector like the UNHCR or other actors, I do think it's very important to mention this, especially as you all know that the figure of the economic migrant, the cheating refugee from the Middle East, is used a lot within Europe. So in Germany it goes like this: refugees undermine and trick the social welfare system. It's the same in the UK and probably in many other countries as well. So it's needless to say that this is wrong, but I say this especially with regard to the rhetoric of the German far right-wing party AfD, because I do think for structural analysis it's important to make these connections. And these narratives of suspicion feed dangerously into the current rise of anti-Islamic narratives that demonize people from Middle Eastern countries, and as they become once again the target and a projection screen in European countries in the form of the fanatic, the terrorist, the threat, or even in the form of the refugee that we talk about today, a broad assessment of these figures that are implemented or that are used, if on purpose or not, is crucial. So the last point would be to talk about who is the undesirable and who isn't, and to maybe briefly introduce the concept of border as method or doing border. Let me check the time. I'm already over, but let's see. So in the beginning I referenced Michel Agier's book Managing the Undesirables from 2011. But now I want to ask, who are the undesirables and who maybe not be one of the undesirables? I also mentioned the spread of conflict beyond the literal border, so I took refugee camps as one example that we can understand as a border in front or behind the literal European border, depending on what side you stand. So while it is indeed true that EU borders are hardening and are technologized, as we can see in the immense budget raise of Frontex and the drastic expansion of private security industries, I'd like us to complicate the well-known notion of the EU as fortress. So in Bernd Kasparek's word, the cultural anthropologist, this fortress metaphor implies that, quote, the border acts as a protective barrier around Europe, of which migrants would figuratively bounce off and be condemned to either a perpetual existence in the netherworlds of transit or to death. And while many people are not allowed to move freely, obviously, we also must clearly know that capital data and certain people do traverse and always have traversed. After all, our economies have a long tradition to rely on large parts on the labor of migrants. Maybe just a recent example from the Corona time. So this became once again very clear during the COVID-19 lockdown in Berlin, where each supermarket and drugstore had security personnel in front of the stores, as well as cleaners who sanitized baskets and trolleys. I mean, we still have that, but not as much anymore. But from what I can tell from my own experience, also in talking to the workers, these low-wage jobs were primarily performed by a migrant workforce. So this is just a excursus. But from my perspective, I think it makes more sense then to understand the border and the migration regime as a heterogeneous field rather than a centrally organized apparatus, a flexible assemblage of actors, agencies, markets, and discourses, rather than a reified monolith that just closes its doors via a clear demarcation line. The political theorists Sandro Mezzara and Brett Nielsen use in their books Border as Method or The Multiplication of Labor the term differential inclusion, which I find useful in this case. It means that borders are exclusive and inclusive at the same time. And I believe this serves us much more to understand the complexities of borders and migration. Sandro Mezzara, in a different time, in a different work, describes how labor mobility has always been for capital both an indispensable resource. There is no capital without labor, he says, of course, but also a threat, that is, labor goes a better place. And he's using the autonomy of migration approach that understands migrant mobility already as a social movement. In the case of refugees, they are not passive subjects that are rendered vulnerable, or that are rendered then, after being rendered vulnerable, manageable as mere aid recipients, but by the generosity of humanitarian agencies. An example of this angle that foregrounds the negotiations, the contestations, the tensions, and also the conflicts is, for instance, laid out by the mentioned Bernd Kasperek and his research group Transmigration. So I can maybe show just a quick, this is how the website looks. And Kasperek in his research, he shows how within Europe, acts of resistances based on, for instance, a refusal to submit fingerprints. Here's another side, places and practices. Just to give you a quick idea, you could check it out later. So Kasperek's research shows within Europe how acts of resistances based on a refusal to submit fingerprints is an effort to circumvent the rules of the Dublin system by means of evasion or escape, by means sometimes even of the mutilation of the fingerprint, of the finger, the ridges. And if it's even only in the realm of the digital database, but it means to resist being a hit in the Eurodac database. So the question, the question of do or don't they have your fingerprints that he was asked by many refugees and migrants that he encountered in his ethnographic research becomes a key question. Do they have your fingerprints or don't they have your fingerprints? If they don't have your fingerprints, then you could still try to get into Germany, for instance, and then start the application process for asylum there. Other than when they have your fingerprints already in Italy, then you will be sent back to Italy. So, what I wanted to do today is to foreground whose labor practices, whose knowledge, whose biometric data and information about personal life and habits are involved in the process of building these borders. That could be, you could understand them maybe as biometric borders, right? And clearly lives are shaped by regulations from above through borders, but also regulation and policies itself are shaped by the autonomy of migration movement that I could not lay out in detail, but just to give you my approach. And exercising the will to move constitutes a social movement in itself. Looking at border regimes and refugee camps like this, it shifts the angle to the social relations that are connected to migrant mobility, to its intersection with labor regimes, interests of capital, and meta-narratives such as the fraudulent refugee that are simmering above and deeply influencing the cultural sphere and the mainstream media and the minds of the people. So the critical traditions I mentioned offer an alternative entry point in this field of struggle, and that it adds to the very important analysis of power structures above, in the sense that they materialize in agencies such as Frontex, maybe a view from below to hopefully also contribute to the larger project of decentering notions around the West as the originator of inventions, towards an understanding that looks maybe rather dialectically at the preconditions under which technology has evolved in the first place. So that was my contribution. I hope you could get something from it, and yeah, thanks again for listening, and I hope you have a nice evening. Goodbye.
Thank you so much to Ariana. That was another really interesting contribution to this evening's discussion. And if you'd like to read more of Ariana's research or her essays, then you can visit her website, arianadongus.com, and she's got lots of material hosted on there.
Closing the evening tonight is Flavia Dzodan, who's a writer, lecturer, and research fellow at the Critical Studies Department at Sandberg Institute. Her research is focused on the politics of artificial intelligence and algorithms at the intersections of neocolonialism, race, and gender. She's the editor of the blog This Political Woman, where she's written about the rise of the alt-right, big data, networks, algorithms, and community surveillance. She's also been published widely, from Dissent magazine to The Guardian to The Washington Post, among others. So this evening, Flavia is going to discuss the notion of the border as a biopolitical site, and she's doing this through the lens of colonization and a term called immunitary dispositif, which was coined and developed by Roberto Esposito in a publication called Community, Immunity and Biopolitics. She's also really interestingly going to talk about the actual physical bodily experience of crossing a border. And throughout, she points to the use of technological devices that are entwined within this process, offering an account of the border not just as a singular entity, but as a series of complex operations. Over to you, Flavia.
If drawing a border is a foundational moment of colonization, maintaining the border through its administration is a continuation of that moment through time. Every day, the border serves as a reminder of the division. These bodies belong to this side of the border. These bodies belong to the other side. You arrive at the border and you are only allowed through if you carry the approved paperwork. Do you have the right passport? Do you have a visa? Do you come from a country whose citizens are allowed to circulate? Do you have enough money to support yourself? You answer these questions and you try to keep your anxiety to yourself every time. You need to keep your composure. Depending on who you are, crossing the border depends on not only being able to prove that you should be allowed, but also appearing, presenting yourself like you belong to the other side of the border. If you're nervous, if you're sweaty, you appear suspicious, like those who don't belong. I am a sickly child. My mom takes my temperature several times a day. I live with the constant risk of infection. I spend my time in bed reading cookbooks, mostly looking at the pictures of lavish foods I cannot consume. By age 6, I am already acutely aware of my body temperature and its fluctuations. Now, no longer a child, I become acutely aware of my body temperature and its fluctuations, but for different reasons. I think of the temperature of bodies and the intimate nature of taking someone's temperature. The mother measuring the child, a lover touching her partner's forehead, the teacher at school worried for her student, a doctor or a nurse checking on her patients, small moments of care. I read. Studies using thermal imaging have suggested that face and body temperature increase during periods of sexual arousal. Additionally, facial skin temperature changes are associated with other forms of emotional arousal, including fear and stress. Fear and stress, like when you are a migrant crossing a border and you know you might be told no, with little reason, for no reason at all, or when you are escaping economic conditions that would lead you and your loved ones to a sure death. I read Ahmet Ögüt's essay, From Immunitary Dispositif to Affirmative Ethics, published in April 2020. I take these arguments on biopolitical borders a step further and argue that in the current context, biopolitical borders are increasingly becoming immunitary dispositif for those who enjoyed all the privileges of liberal mobility regime before COVID-19. For Roberto Esposito, borders and immigration controls are solid expressions of immunization paradigm of the modern state and its biopolitical existence. The term immunity refers to the resistance of an organism to the harmful effects of pathogens. In political juridical language, immunity denotes an attempt to protect the social body from the danger of communal interaction through the use of what it opposes. For Esposito, national borders are constitutive elements of an immunity paradigm which presupposes but also negates a community, a common life, an obligation of gift-giving. Immunitas is a negative protection of the self. It implies the exception or exemption from an obligation to care for others. The risk of contamination immediately liquidates contact, relationality, and being in common. At the border, your face is scrutinized to map its effect. Are you relaxed? Do you look scared? Are you a potential threat? You are scanned, and the biometrics of your body will inform the algorithms whether you are a potential danger or not. Enhanced coronavirus health screening. Your temperature becomes a border technology. You cannot cross this border if your temperature is outside the health threshold. Your temperature becomes the immunitary dispositif that Umuto's book refers to in her essay. Foucault thought of the dispositif as institutional, physical, and administrative mechanisms and knowledge structures that keep power structures alive. We could say that the pandemic is in the process of creating a new dispositif of immunity. The power structure protects itself by casting away those who are sick. Quarantine, lockdown, a detention camp, or even expulsion on the spot. Did your temperature raise because you are nervous? Were you aroused? Nobody asks if you are comfortable, just if you are cool enough to cross. It is always at the border that your body travels as data. That surveillance that scans your biometrics, your face, your passport, and now your temperature. It is in this act that until now was rather intimate that you either pass through or not. It might be that your body as data can cross the border, but your physical body is not allowed to do so. Your body as data might even travel further through other borders when data is shared across the European Union member states. The colonial taxonomies and systems of organization, in turn, continue living in our contemporary database. Census data continues aggregating 18th century racial classifications. Police and military surveillance databases continue indexing human beings based on arbitrary colonial divisions across racial, sexual, and gender lines instituted as a mechanism to divide those deserving of rights and protections and those who were deemed lesser than. These classifications are used to train algorithms based on data points that are assigned to each category. What kind of data is associated to those archived in databases as Black, Muslim, or woman? How is the data associated to these categories used to predict behaviors? Machines create predictive models based on the same prejudice and stereotypes that have been associated to each of these taxonomies for centuries. The body gets scanned at the border. The algorithm assigns it a place in the database based on a strict taxonomical order. The place in the database determines if you are allowed to cross the border or not. Alien, citizen, Black, non-European Union, a Muslim name, an address in an EU-friendly country, flagged or not flagged. The algorithm is smooth. The entire process can take a few seconds, unless you are flagged and marked for human intervention. An immigration officer will review you, ask questions, scrutinize you further. You are at the border. The algorithms break you into manageable points, each to fill a different taxonomy, a little field of data with input scanned through your body. Your iris is now in Poland. Your limbs are in Spain. Your face is used to model a new French application in the perpetual fight against terrorism. Your physical body, however, is in that spatial limbo between borders before you are properly admitted. You stand there waiting, unaware that you are having an out-of-body experience through technological means. For the love of nation, they say, to protect our people, to save lives. Again, recalling Foucault's notion of biopower, first in the 17th century through the constitution of the individual through anatomopolitics, and a century later the constitution of biopower on population scale. The administration of not only individual bodies, but also the careful compilation of birth rates, disease, contagion, and the statistics of death. These moments as foundational to the capitalist enterprise and the notion of human resources, physically apt for production, healthy bodies to be separated from the unhealthy one. The body temperature of the migrant, the border crosser, now constituted as an instrument of border control. Neither militarization nor technologies of warfare can protect the colonial line of demarcation during plagues. The migrant herself becomes the bioweapon threat. I read the medical literature involving research about the racial and gender differences in body temperature. A study done in 1993 concluded that there is a difference in body temperature between black and white women. Karl Reinhold August Wunderlich, a 19th century physician, is considered the first to have measured mean body temperature in healthy humans. Although he did not personally study the influence of race on body temperature, he deferred to the observations of Livingstone's travels and explorations in South Africa, who noted that the body temperatures of natives were 1.8 degrees Celsius greater than his own. Through the immunity dispositif, racial profiling just gained a new biopolitical indicator. You need to stay 2 meters apart to save lives now, I read in some posters shared on social media. Save lives now, written in bigger red fonts to stress the importance of keeping distance. In Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, refugees from the Syrian civil war share makeshift tents made with sheets of tarpaulin. Europe has washed its hands on Syrian refugees. No more are allowed to pass the suffocating borders erected by the Union. The ones that do live in Europe already are no less cramped than their Lebanese counterparts. Camp Moria in Lesbos, Greece, was built for a capacity of 3,100 people, but now deals with a population of more than 20,000 men, women and children. Even before the threat of COVID-19, the only emergency medical provider for the entire camp was available between the evening hours of 4 and 11. In order to prevent that they attempt to reach other parts of Europe, the Dutch government proposes to temporarily house these migrants in cruise ships rather than allowing them to leave the camp. In the Ellwangen camp in Baden-Württemberg, Germany, nearly half of the roughly 600 people living in the facilities tested positive for COVID-19, but are still forced to share facilities with everyone else. The entire camp was placed in lockdown at the beginning of April, with police guarding the entrance to make sure no one leaves or enters. The camps themselves constitute a border. The migrant is simultaneously within the border of the European Union and excluded from the border protections afforded by being in the European Union. The refugee, the migrant, the detained undocumented immigrant, they live in a permanent state of exception for whom the protections of being within the boundaries do not apply. The border then, as the space where humanity is stripped and bodies are reduced to the biological functions, Affect is only taken into account insofar as it can be used to identify the level of threat that the body poses. Temperature is thoroughly scrutinized vis-à-vis its physiological purpose. Does this body represent a threat of contagion? Is this a vector of disease? While thousands of migrants have died of hypothermia and cold trying to reach Europe, an elevated body temperature can represent the difference between crossing a border or not. Several European governments are currently discussing immunity passports that would grant the bearers an extensive freedom of movement and the ability to cross borders. The Republic of Ragusa, an aristocratic maritime republic founded in the 14th century in current-day Croatia, implemented the first known plague passports at the end of the 14th century. During the Black Death that decimated most of Europe in the late 14th and 15th century, Ragusa implemented a sophisticated system of border control to prevent the infected from accessing the city's limits. More than 6 centuries later, in one instance currently being tested in the UK, those deemed clear of the virus could then prove their status via code generated by an app in a modern-day version of Ragusa's immunity passport. Estonia is also currently testing another immunity passport, which would allow citizens to show their coronavirus test results to third parties, such as employers or even restaurants. The borders that we're allowed or disallowed to cross expand further than mere geographies. A spokesperson for the company developing the technology for the Estonian system said that it would diminish fears and stimulate societies all over the globe to move on with their lives amidst the pandemic. Meanwhile, in the European Union, refugee camps, migrants share cramped conditions and are forbidden from circulating in the outside world. Tourism, with its own regime of international circulation, has come to a standstill. The Dutch government, under the guise of pragmatism, proposes to cool the camps off by housing the migrants that live in the legal limbo that are refugee camps in cruise ships. The temperature of borders depends on who is doing the crossing. If drawing a border is a foundational moment of colonization, maintaining the border through its administration is a continuation of that moment through time.
Thank you so much to Flavia for closing the programme with such a thought-provoking contribution. Thinking about how all these issues can mutate and shift in the wake of a pandemic feels like such a pertinent way to round up the discussion. So we wanted to thank all of our participants for sharing their valuable research with us this evening, and for all of those who are able to come along virtually to watch. We hope you found this as interesting as we have. So Technologising the EU border, the theme of tonight's event, is one of 3 strands that we're researching for our second publication, the other 2 being Outsourcing Europe's Borders and Migration, Extraction and Colonialism. They'll also take the form of 2 online programmes later on this year, so do look out for those. We wanted to take this opportunity to send a message of solidarity to those who are fighting for racial justice across the Atlantic, and also to those who have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. The urgency of this current moment is a stark reminder of how many states are inseparable from racist policies of exclusion, violence and oppression. So wherever you are, we hope you're taking care. Please do get in touch over the chat or email if you've got any questions about this evening. Again, thank you so much for coming.